everybody. Welcome to episode 3 of the Make a Difference podcast. I'm Farra, along with my co-host Darius, and we are so excited to have Nick and Whitney here with us today from the Archibald Project. And they're doing incredible things in not only their community, but also overseas. And we can't wait to hear more. Thank you guys so much for being with us today.
Yes.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump right in. Can you guys give us the history of the Archibald Project, how it started, and what you guys are up to?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Let's do it.
You can tell it, then I'll fill in the gaps.
Okay. This is one of my favorite stories to tell, so I'll try to be quick with it.
She won't be quick.
So I was a wedding photographer, and Nick, this amazingly good-looking man next to me, was an airline pilot. And I was on a photo shoot for a dear friend, or an old friend. I hadn't really kept up with her or spoken to her much in the past 10 years. And so I was on this photo shoot photographing her 2-year-old daughter. And at the end of the photo shoot, I asked if they were going to have more children. And the mom was like, well, we're actually in the process of adopting. And that is when I felt like the clouds parted. I felt like I heard deep in my spirit, you're supposed to go to Bulgaria with them and photograph their adoption. And I looked at the mom and I was like, I think I'm supposed to go with you and photograph your adoption. And she was like
you do, like you say to people that you haven't seen in a while.
She was like, let me talk to my husband. And I was like, oh yeah, let me talk to my husband too. But because Nick was an airline pilot, we actually could go with them and document their adoption. And so we got on a flight. We flew standby to Bulgaria a few months after this photo shoot. We documented the adoption of a little 7-year-old boy who has Down syndrome. And we put the photos on Facebook because it was just this really beautiful story of a dad going and loving this child and adopting him into his family. And so we just put the photos on Facebook and didn't really think much of it. And then a few weeks later, a total stranger emailed us and said, hey, I just want to let you know that because of your photos of this adoption, we found our son, and we are now adopting a child who's chronically ill from Ukraine. And if it hadn't been for your photos, we never would have found our son. And so we kind of looked at each other and we're like, oh my gosh, photos
this could be something.
Yeah, get kids adopted or help kids. And so, we were really naive back then, but we got with a lawyer and we formed a 501c3 nonprofit, and we named it after the little Bulgarian boy, and his name's Archibald. And so we called it the Archibald Project.
Yeah.
And in the next few years, Nick was still an airline pilot and I was still doing weddings. And we just kind of went in our vacation time or spare time, we would travel around documenting international adoptions and making little YouTube documentaries in our spare time, really.
Yeah, we did it all on vacation time at first. And then we started learning more, seeing the impact that we could have, and even seeing how what we were doing and highlighting adoptions was good and it was a needed part, but that it was just part of a larger problem that kids are being separated from their family.
Yeah.
And so we started kind of redeveloping the mission and the purpose to not just include adoption, but also include things like keeping families together and how can we support vulnerable families, not just internationally, but even here at home. And as that was all unfolding, we realized, oh man, we could maybe do this full time.
Yeah, this is bigger than just vacation time.
Right at the beginning of at the end of 2014, we took a big leap and both quit our jobs. Whitney stopped taking weddings and I quit my job at the airlines, and we took this thing full time. And we were pretty terrified, but hey, we're still going. So.
Yeah, we're here. So it's been about 5 years now. And like Nick said, our mission has kind of evolved into a more holistic view of caring for vulnerable children and inspiring people to get involved in whatever capacity they can into caring for vulnerable children and families, so that hopefully there will be fewer orphans in the world.
Because really one of the biggest obstacles to people getting involved with caring for vulnerable children is, one, fear. It's kind of a scary idea. It's really unknown. And then two, people don't know where to even start or what to do. And so we use stories to inspire people to get beyond their fear and show them what they can do because other people are doing it.
Yeah.
What a story. I
Maybe
love
that's more
that.
than
You were
you
just
looking
like,
for,
hey, I'm
sorry.
supposed to go to Bulgaria with you, so let's do this.
And then here we are, like 10 years later, and it's a thing.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So,
Well, that's quite a story and obviously amazing things that you guys are doing. Super awesome.
thanks.
Well, thank
It's
you.
been a challenging road, but we're really thankful that we did it and we took that jump.
Yeah, it's fun to tell the story, but I
Mhm.
mean, that span of years of doing this, there's been a lot of highs and a lot of lows. Like any business or nonprofit, it's difficult to
Sure.
keep it going, but it's also been really life-giving at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just from, hearing that and also looking at your website and stuff, you guys have a heart for, as you put it, helping to address the orphan crisis.
Yeah.
And so my thinking was, can you explain a little bit just what the orphan crisis actually is? And then also just touch on how we can address it aside from the other things of adoption, because you mentioned the word holistic, and so maybe just give us a lens of that, because that's your arena that you're operating in.
Yeah.
Man, that is a huge question, but such a good question. I feel like when you say the orphan crisis, there are certain camps that will kind of push back on and say, no, we don't have an orphan crisis, we have a family crisis. And so it kind of just depends how people want to frame it. Either way, there's a lot of vulnerable children, and I think a lot of people come under the impression that all orphans don't have parents, like all these kids don't have parents. And it's a new movement that's kind of bringing to light the idea that, oh, hey, a lot of these kids that are in orphanages actually have living parents. And if you could support their families in a healthy way, a lot of them could return home.
Can I touch back on
Yeah,
that?
sure.
So I feel like you should keep talking.
Oh, thank you.
No, that's good to know. That's like, I want to take you back for a second. So the crisis, we have this 411, the 411 on the orphan crisis on our website, but I'll give you like a really, really high overview.
Give me the 411.
Like really high overview. This is like not in depth at all. So basically, international adoption didn't really exist until the late 1950s. Okay. And that happened when a Christian man from America went over to South Korea and saw all these babies living in these homes, and they were casualties of war. And so their parents either died in the war or were missing in action. And so somebody needed to care for these babies. And so orphanages have always been around, but they did not always, orphanages purposes were not always to house a child forever until that child reached adulthood, and then that child would leave. And orphanages were not intended to house a child until another family from a different country came and adopted them. And so in the 1950s, international adoption was brought onto the scene in the Western world by these people who were really well-meaning and really they wanted to help because they just saw all these children in South Korea who needed family. And so they're like, we will be that family. And so in order to bring them to America, they had to actually have a bunch of laws passed to create international adoption and to make it legal. Mm-hmm. So that was the start of international adoption. And that kind of started the movement and the vocabulary in the West for people to help children overseas who didn't have families. And I think there was some miscommunication that happened over the next 70 years where we are now, to where people in the West were like, oh, there's children and their moms and dads have passed away and they need to be adopted, or they need a home and I'm going to fund the building of an orphanage. And so there's well-meaning people.
Well, and a lot of that miscommunication came from some definitions that were put out there that there are 153 million orphans, which we've even said when we were less educated on it. But a lot of those kids are considered orphans that still have one living parent. But by our Western definition, we think
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
But according to this international definition, it is an orphan, but we brought it up against our Western context and assumed, oh, these kids don't have parents. And so the next logical conclusion is we need to, with good intentions,
Right.
is to do something for all these kids. And it started to, because we didn't fully understand everything, it kind of led to a place that we didn't intend. And that was all
By
done
we,
out
you
of
mean like the Western
world.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people did it because they wanted to help and they love these kids and they want to see them cared for. But it, as that progressed and developed, it created other problems. And people, you have corrupt people that then take advantage and open orphanages just to raise money, and then they're
Stealing
bringing
the
kids
money,
in from the
there's
community or
trafficking.
trafficking kids, and all sorts of things happen. And so with all that, what's happening now is when you say orphan crisis, there are still tons of vulnerable children out there. They're not all necessarily orphans by the maybe Western context we define it as, is having no living parents. And so what's happening, or what needs to happen now, is more of investment in community, in these local communities, because that's what's going to
And job development,
actually change poverty or things like that is causing the breakdown of the family. You're never going to eliminate the breakdown of the family. That even happens here with lots of resources. But
so then elaborate a little bit on the community aspect. Like when you say community, investing in community.
That would be the answer to your second part of the question, is like how to holistically care for vulnerable children.
So it's a process, and there's even different people that have different opinions about this, but I think it's one of those things that's just going to happen slowly over time. Like, you have to invest in the community, but you can't, like, that's not going to happen immediately. So you can't just pull all the kids out of the orphanages right away, maybe the dangerous ones, but we have to slowly, like, right. And I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of our money from the Western church or just different NGOs goes toward orphanages or things like that, right? But what if we invested that money in a community by helping create schools and jobs and uplifted that community? There would be less separation, because a lot of women will think they have, 6 or 7 kids and they have another one and they're like, I can't care for it, but there's this place that can give them an education and maybe they'll get adopted and they'll have a better life. But they don't want to part with that child.
They don't want to leave their child. But 80% of children who are living in an orphanage have one or both living parents, and the number one cause for a child ending up in an orphanage is poverty. And so if we really want to look at the root cause of why children are being abandoned or placed in orphanages that leads them to adoption is poverty. And so if we can go into these communities and have job development, have like food sources, of daycare. So one of the big things is like, okay, so say a single mom has a job now, but she has 5 kids and school's out of session. What is she supposed to do? Leave her 5 kids at home and leave them super vulnerable and susceptible to predators or danger? And so a lot of times she'll say, I can't do that. So she'll put them in the orphanage. So if there was a community preschool or daycare to where you're employing women and men now to be the workers at this daycare, but then you're also giving parents a safe place to keep their kids during the day, but then they can go pick them up at night and they can take them home and they can still provide for their family, rather than having to actually place them in an orphanage and relinquish their parental rights to them forever.
So I have like 30 questions, but
same, the wheels in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh. And it's so interesting because we're talking about this obviously right now from an international standpoint. This is what's happening internationally, but as we're having this discussion and you're talking about childcare and poverty and all of this, I'm thinking, but this is actually also a lot of the same issues that we see in this country.
For sure.
Why people are giving up their children in this country is for the same reasons, which I think is another interesting topic, because a lot of times we think that that's not what's really happening here, but that is what's happening here.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, it's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed from the starting point rather than what do we do with these kids and how do we keep them safe? But really the question we should be asking is, how do we enable these parents to not feel like they have to make this choice to give their child up?
To kind of tie a neat bow on your original question that I feel like we talked a lot about, to holistically care for these vulnerable children, both here and internationally, you have to look at each individual child's situation, because some kids, the best option for them is adoption, and it will be, and that's okay. And some kids, the best option is that they go back to their family. Other kids might have a totally different thing that is best for them, but it's really difficult, and it takes a lot of work to deal with kids on that sort of micro level. But that's what needs to happen if you're gonna holistically care for them.
We need more social workers,
and that holds true here
locally, like everywhere, to be following up on each child and doing home visits to ensure, and orphanage and babies homes and institutional visits to ensure that these children are truly being cared for as best as they can be.
Because even domestically, we sorry, I'll end after this. Even domestically, you know, we have like some parents, if they just had a little bit of support, can get their kids out of foster care and back in their family, but they need help, right? You know, it's hard. There's a lot of different situations out there. And then some parents, it's just enough time has passed and they have to move on and maybe be adopted or something like that. And it's hard. You can't always prevent that separation, but you got to look at it individually.
And adoption is a wonderful thing, right? I mean, you're absolutely right. When there is a situation where that is what's going to be best for the child, for whatever the reason is, I mean, what a wonderful thing that adoption is in place. And there's many reasons why people adopt a child, many reasons, and that's wonderful. But obviously there's way more children that are in that situation than there are parents that are ready and willing to adopt.
Yeah, and you know, adoption is it's born out of tragedy, and it is, I think, I'm on this journey myself because we have 3 adopted children, but as the adoptive parent, the narrative of adoption is very different than the way my children's narrative of their adoption will be. And so as the parent who gets to adopt, like you said, like it's amazing and it's beautiful, but there's a lot of adoptees out there who might not agree with that statement. And that is heartbreaking because their life started, or at some point they experienced this deep trauma of the separation of their biological family. And that's really hard. And so, yeah, adoption, an adult adoptee the other day in an interview, she said, I have to be okay with the fact that I will always, for my entire life, walk hand in hand with pain and joy.
Right.
And it's this weird marriage of the two, and it never goes away. And I was like, that's a really like sobering statement to think about. But yeah, so adoption is really beautiful and also very tragic.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you guys have been in, I think it was like 19, 20 countries now, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. Has there been more countries that are like just more predominant where you see these issues more? What are some of the like? It's leading to another question, but the countries where you're seeing this issue the most, are there particular countries where this issue is more widespread than others?
I don't know if I can say, I mean, there are numbers that maybe one is more widespread. I'd say it's more just that it's very different in each country. It's easy, like I was saying before, we try to make policy about how we care for kids on a large level, but man, when you dig into each country, it's very different. Like I think of Burkina Faso was a country we spent some time in that was just a really beautiful but really hard place, really awesome people, but the challenges they were facing were very different culturally than some other places in Africa. And then you go to somewhere like Romania and maybe their physical needs are cared for a little more there. Like they have a nicer building that they live in that vulnerable kids do. But gosh, the mental state there is really, really dark. And even just the history of the country itself in Romania and how there got to be so many children separated from family. It's systemic and it's really sad. And a lot of it was done by the government and coming out of communism. And you put that up against an African country and it's just a very different, like there's some similarities, but also really
but I think
big
the
differences.
physical ways societies are caring for vulnerable children, it's like first world. We want to like make sure everybody knows, like, we don't have orphanages, we don't have institutions, but we do. We just don't call them that anymore. Whereas if you go to a second world or a third world country, you have way more large group homes. And whether you want to call that an institution where you've got 75 kids to one caregiver, or it's a baby's home where, you know, you've got 10 to 15 young children below the age of 5 with one caregiver. You can call it different things, but kind of like in the Western world, we don't do orphanages. We do foster care. We do group homes, but they're like small, quote unquote, but they're still it's not a family. It's not a substitute for a family. And so I would say you see more family-based almost family-based aim in a lot more Western countries that have maybe the ability to do that. And then you look at kind of more developing countries and you see more Western influence coming in and building homes, larger group homes. Would you say that's accurate?
Which is interesting because we kind of treat things differently in our own country than we do in developing countries.
Because
and that's part of what is driving the change.
Yeah.
People are realizing that.
Yeah.
Now, as it relates to the work itself, when you're dealing with these different countries, what are some of the challenges you guys are seeing just with allocation of like resources? Because you're not just like, you know, you're not just, there's particular worldviews, ideologies, actual like cultures that, like you said, history, government, you know, communism, et cetera, et cetera. So have you guys been finding like challenges in terms of allocating resources, building relationships, things like that?
I don't know. So at least from our work, I mean, a lot of what we're saying right now is just stuff we've learned through our work, but we don't actually deal firsthand with solving these problems, or, you know, we're not allocating anything to children personally, but what we're trying to do is learn and then tell the story and show people what truth is and how they can fit into that. We're trying to inspire people to do something about an issue that feels too big for them to do something. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if I know that or not. I bet there are challenges with that, but
I mean, the people that we've met, we usually try to partner with locals in the countries that we go to and share their stories and what they are doing to pour into their communities. And so I would say that they have shared some heartache and frustrations, but they also are giving their entire lives. And usually these people are older and they've been there doing it their whole life, like pouring into these children. Mm-hmm. And so I know that's not really answering your question, but I'm always really inspired by the way people do what they can with what they have, regardless of what they're met with government. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it is answering my question to a degree, because you couldn't actually answer my question because my question wasn't really applicable to you. You know, you're not doing the work. But maybe transitioning from that, being here, you're Americans, you have family of your own. What has that journey been like? Because you're still here doing life here, but yet your hearts are being extended outward, and you're building and raising, you know, your own family, having adoptive kids. How's that process been? What have been the challenges that you've faced, or setbacks, or things you didn't foresee, or just fear?
Oh man, I mean, the biggest one has just been time. Honestly, I mean, we went from having 0 kids to 3, and so
we adopted 3 kids at once.
Yeah,
for anybody out there.
Yeah, we didn't have triplets. But Yeah, it's hard to balance that time of family. And honestly, we really haven't done a traveling story other than domestic stuff since we adopted. And then the pandemic hit. So we have had to kind of find creative ways to continue to tell the stories that we want to tell.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will change in the future. But I think that's a big part of it, is a lot of our focus was already and has naturally shifted toward a lot of domestic foster care work. And we're seeing a lot of fruit with that. And then I would also say just even our own adoption experience has filled us with so much more empathy for the people that we had been working with. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we probably said things when we were documenting an adoption with a family or didn't understand what they were going through and were maybe insensitive, or I don't know. And now, having been through it ourselves, I feel like we're filled with so much more knowledge and empathy and like, oh my gosh, now I get it. And then even seeing our children's experience and knowing on even a firsthand deeper level how important and healing it can be to have a family, like just how big of a role that plays in your life. And it's easy to take for granted if you've always grown up with it, but man, that separation from your core family or having a core family is just devastating to children. And I've watched our kids really heal, and it's beautiful to see.
So without, maybe being too personal on that aspect of that healing process, how's that been? Because you have children, I don't know what countries they're from, but they're coming here and they're being with people who love them. But, at the same time, like you spoke to earlier, Whitney, there's potentially could be aspects of, my history, my past, my previous, my family, or whatever dynamics might go into that. So how hard is that process, or just what has that been like, raising kids that?
Yeah. So we have the privilege of doing what we do at the Archibald Project, which means we get to talk to a lot of adult adoptees and a lot of parents who have been adoptive parents longer than we have. And we get to learn so much from them and their experiences. And then we try to implement a lot of those things.
So basically we're perfect. We're killing it.
Not at all. Into our own family and our own story. And so a few key things that I think are really important when raising children through adoption is always talking about adoption and birth families with the most, just so much honor and respect, no matter what the adoptive parent might think about a past situation with a birth family, just like always talking about how loved they are by their birth family and now us, and how it's because of how loved they were that we became a family. And we honor their country, their birth country, and we talk about it, and we have the Congo flag in our house, and we show pictures all the time and video. And we were fortunate enough to live in Congo for 7 months with them, and it was so hard because we were becoming parents for the first time and lots of things, but I think that was huge so that we could be able to have those memories with the kids, but also have so many pictures and videos, just constantly be talking about it. And another thing is, like, if they have questions, answering them honestly and not being afraid of just maybe like, I don't want to say rejection, but I think a lot of adoptive parents are afraid, like, oh, you're going to want to leave me and go find biological family, or you're going to not love me as much as your biological mom and dad. And I would say that as adoptive parents, like, you can't believe those things. Like, you have to honor your child and honor their history and their birth family and their country of origin, and just it can be support that.
It can be really easy to be insecure as an adoptive parent, but it's way more healing for the child to make room and make space for their pain, even if it's about their adoption. Because there's still, that's based in brokenness. And so if they're sad about that, we can't as parents then be like, oh, you think I'm a bad parent, I should have never adopted you, and blah, blah. Be like let them feel those feelings
and cry
and
with
process
them.
that, and let them ask the questions about their other family, because everything we've learned is that is actually so healing to be able to put those pieces together from their past and to just mourn with them the brokenness. I mean, think about it. If any of us are experiencing something really hard in our lives, the last thing we want is someone telling us, oh, no, it's fine. You have all this instead. And that's great. Like that just feels kind of like a cheap shot. And so we need to offer our children the same thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So simple question. How can people help you guys with what you're doing?
Money, tons of money.
I mean, in the nonprofit world, he's actually.
Yes, right.
Okay,
I
tons
think,
of money, send money, send
yes,
money.
There you go. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that helps our mission is when people share our stories, because really the bigger audience that we can capture, the more people are seeing the stuff, the more people are learning, they're being inspired, they're getting over their fears, and then are able to get involved. And that's how our mission is accomplished. And I think that as it continues to grow, this movement is created to where to not be caring for vulnerable children in some capacity, whether it's CASA worker or international adoption or keeping families together, all these different ways to not be doing something would be abnormal. And when we can make
want to normalize
when we can make that abnormal,
children.
You hit that tipping point and man, our world is going to look very different. And then as that continues down the road in the future, think about these kids that grow up in these really terrible, hard situations. That tends to perpetuate itself through adulthood, and then they have kids, and then the cycle continues. But imagine what it would do to our world as we can better care for all these children. They become adults who then can care better for their children, and you break that cycle, and it changes everything. You have new leaders in countries that are coming from good families and proper care. That's a world game changer, really.
So sharing our stories is helpful. And I mean, we are in COVID and we are a nonprofit. And so we're having to get really creative with our fundraising. So we have some super creative ideas coming up that we'll be releasing on social media soon. But yeah, I think sharing stories, following us on Instagram, following us on YouTube, sharing our podcast we have a podcast also called Around the World with the Archibald Project.
Right.
Sending it to friends and family is super helpful. And then cash money.
So with those Benjamins, what does, so say I want to donate, right? I want to help.
Mm-hmm.
What, for a lot of people, there's usually the question, what happens with my money? Can you maybe give us a little bit of insight into that? If someone is.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. I mean, really every dollar that comes into the Archibald Project goes toward helping produce the different types of stories that we make. So it's basically one of those things that there's really not a lot of money in vulnerable child stories or foster care stories, right? And so if they're going to get told, somebody has to tell them, and that's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So because we're an advocacy organization, this is how it works. It's like taking a stone and throwing it in a lake, and then the ripples just go forever, right? So when somebody donates to the Archibald Project, we're able then to go make, say, this video about foster care. And then that video lives on our YouTube forever. And I mean, our videos are viewed hundreds of thousands of times, and you have no idea in the people who are viewing it who now is getting involved in foster care, or who now is getting involved in caring for birth parents who've lost their children to foster care and helping support them. And so we get emails all the time saying, like, hey, because of your podcast, hey, because of this video on YouTube, hey, because of this blog post, hey, because of this Instagram post, I'm now doing X, Y, and Z. And children's lives are being changed, I would say daily, because of the stories that the Archibald Project is able to produce. And so while we aren't giving a child a meal or giving a child a pair of shoes, we're doing something that we believe will last longer than one meal or last longer than the pair of shoes. It will last their entire lifetime because somebody is coming into their life and loving them unconditionally through the work and the inspiration of the Archibald Project.
Yeah, a couple of my favorite stories. One I think they're both from our podcast. I can't really remember exactly, but one, there's this family or this couple that they started fostering because of seeing some of our work. And then the people around them, their friends and community, saw them fostering. And now they started fostering because they saw their friends doing it, which then touches another community, and that spreads, right? All from somebody helping us tell one or a few stories. Then another girl, she listened to our podcast for a while and ended up, I think she's in the UK, ended up changing her major or became a social worker now because of the stories that that people allowed us to tell. So now think of all the lives that she's going to impact because she changed her major from seeing or hearing a few stories.
Somebody became a psychotherapist because of the Archibald Project so that she could work with traumatized children in the foster care system and give them therapy. I was like, wow. I couldn't have even fathomed that on that first trip to Bulgaria, right? Like we were thinking adoption, and now there's just so many things happening because of the stories that the Archibald Project can tell, and it's really humbling and really cool.
And really that's why we use storytelling, is because we've learned, and a lot of other people know this, that it just has the ability to meet so many different people in so many different places. And that's what makes it so powerful.
And storytelling changes the world. And that's our motto.
I love that. You mentioned, you mentioned that your organization is all about advocacy, which, yes, and I think that's so wonderful. Where do you see the Archibald Project in the future morphing into other areas? Do you foresee getting involved with policy, for instance, right? Policy that can really change the way, obviously in this country specifically, since that's where we are. But do you foresee yourselves getting involved with policy that could change the way the system works in this country or things like that? Or are you guys very much ingrained in your roots and that's what's happening?
I think we'll always hang on to story. But one thing we are working on currently is we have a lot of stuff that inspires people, but we don't have great avenues to actually plug people into the things to take the next step. So we're actually working on our website in a way that will help do that, to kind of take people to that next step. And then in terms of policy, that is something that we've talked about that we hope for in the future. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it would be something that I hope that the voice of the Archibald Project, which is the collective people that support us and believe in this work, would become big and strong enough that we could influence policy and leaders in our country.
That's great. That's awesome. I think, we'll wrap up here. I feel like we could talk about this for days. It's just there's so much to unpack, right? But I, if it's okay, and if not, that's totally fine, but I would love to hear a little bit more about your specific adoption story and how did this happen? 3 kiddos at once and from 0 to 3, just like that. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can share a little bit. So because of the Archibald Project, we worked with this organization in the Republic of Congo, not the DRC Congo. And we worked with them because their main goal was to keep children in biological families or keep children in foster care families in the Congo. And they wouldn't, if a woman came to the gate with a child trying to give the child to the baby's home, they would normally say, no, we're not accepting this baby, but you can come in and we'll help you. And so they give women jobs, they give women different support, different housing situations to keep women on their feet so that women can keep their children. And we love that. That is my favorite type of caring for vulnerable children because they get to stay with their families.
Absolutely.
So we were there working with them, documenting. They have conducted international adoptions, and it's always the last resort for that child. So we were there documenting an adoption, fell in love with their organization, stayed in contact, came home, stayed in contact for years. And then they invited us back to do some more media for them. And in the email, they said, oh, and hey, keep me praying for these 3 siblings. We're trying to find them a family as well. And that just kind of sparked in us this narrative of, well, could we be their family? And we spent a couple months talking about it and praying through it and seeking advice and counsel, and then we said yes, and then we adopted 3 kids.
That's awesome. I love that. That's
Yeah,
really great.
I mean, it's definitely been a very raw few years. In, you know, our kids were 4 and 5. We have twins, and then they have an older brother, and so we got our children when they were a little bit older, and they'd had experiences in life that, you know, a lot of children don't have. And it's just been a ongoing journey of commitment and saying, like, we love you no matter what. We are here for you. We are not leaving you. We're in this. And so it's been really cool to watch all of us heal and all of us grow and all of us bond together. And yeah, it's been crazy.
For sure. So we spoke about, you know, stones in the water, ripple effect. And
yeah.
Where can people follow along with you, lock arms with you, virtually speaking? Where can they find you at?
Yeah. So our website is just thearchibaldproject.com. Then our Instagram, we share a lot of stuff on Instagram. That's kind of how we get our messaging out to the world. And that's just at the Archibald Project. Mm-hmm. And then we have a podcast called Around the World with the Archibald Project. And then we have YouTube and Pinterest. I just started Pinterest recently.
And you can get connected to most all that stuff. Either we post what's new on Instagram and then connect you to it, or it can be found on our website, all of our old work.
And we are rolling out a
blogs.
new website in November, and we're really excited about it.
Let's go.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, Nick, Whitney, thank you for being with us today on the Make a Difference podcast. You are doing that, so we just want to commend you and stay steadfast in that.
Thank you.
For everyone watching, thank you for spending the time with us. Click and follow along with their journey. Support them. Send in cash money. Everything you gotta do, because they're doing work that matters. And so anything that you can do to help was much appreciated. And so, this has been another episode of the Make a Difference podcast. I am your host, host, Darius with Farra, Nick and Whitney from the Archibald Project. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, guys. We appreciate it.
We're honored.
Later.